There is a voice in your head right now. It has been there your entire life, commenting, judging, narrating, worrying, planning, remembering. And here is the strange thing. You have always assumed that voice is you, but just now, as you heard those words, as that voice inside repeated them back, added its own commentary, perhaps said, yes, that's true, or I'm not sure about that, who was the one noticing the voice doing all of that? There is the voice, and there is something that hears it. And the moment you try to look directly at that something, it vanishes, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. This is not a riddle with a clever answer waiting at the end. This is an invitation to discover that the question itself, when followed far enough, does something far more interesting than answer itself. It dissolves. It began before you could speak. Long before language arrived, before you could name a single thing in the world around you, something was already organizing your experience into categories, sorting sensations, distinguishing pleasure from discomfort, preparing the ground for the commentary that would eventually come. And then, somewhere around the age of 2 or perhaps 3, the voice arrived. Not gradually, not through some gentle apprenticeship, but all at once, as though a radio had finally found its frequency after years of static. Suddenly there were words for everything, for the warmth of sunlight, for the smell of bread, for the particular texture of your mother's voice when she was worried. And with the words came something else entirely. The narrator who used them. Now, here is what I find genuinely extraordinary about it. Nobody taught you to run a continuous internal commentary on your own existence. Nobody sat you down and said, right, from now on, you will evaluate your breakfast before you eat it, rehearse conversations that haven't happened yet, replay arguments that ended 3 years ago with much better responses than the ones you actually gave, and compose in elaborate detail speeches you will never deliver to anyone. And yet here you are, doing precisely that, with breathtaking consistency. The voice is running right now, isn't it? It is reading these words back to you in your own particular accent, adding its own commentary, perhaps agreeing, perhaps resisting, perhaps already telling you that it already knows all of this. The voice has opinions about the weather. It has opinions about other people's opinions. It has, most spectacularly, opinions about its own opinions, which means it will argue with itself at 3 in the morning with the same conviction a barrister brings to court. You are, in a very practical sense, never alone. There is always this other presence alongside you, this tireless correspondent, this inner journalist, filing urgent dispatches on the human condition from somewhere just behind your eyes. And most people accept this arrangement so completely, so utterly, without question, that when you suggest the voice might not actually be them, when you suggest there may be a distinction between the commentary and the one who hears it, they look at you as though you have said something faintly dangerous. But there are moments, you know the ones I mean, very early in the morning, before the narrator has properly reported for duty. In the middle of music that bypasses thought entirely and travels straight to somewhere older and quieter inside you, in the pause between one breath and the next, when for just an instant nobody is doing anything at all, in those brief, unremarkable gaps, the voice goes quiet and something notices the quiet. Something that was always there, underneath the noise, witnessing the whole performance from a place that has no address and no name. That something is not loud. It never insists on anything. It simply watches with a patience that has absolutely nothing to do with trying. That is what we are following today. Not the voice, the one that hears it. Try it right now. Try to find the one who is thinking, not the thoughts themselves, those are easy enough to observe. They drift through like clouds across an afternoon sky. But the thinker, the one behind the thoughts, the entity that presumably owns them, generates them, suffers through them at difficult hours, and occasionally takes credit for the brilliant ones. Go ahead. look for it. What happens is rather magnificent if you pay close attention. The moment you turn your attention inward to locate the thinker, you find another thought, a thought about the thinker. And then, if you try to examine that thought, you find yet another thought observing the first one. It is a hall of mirrors that extends in every direction simultaneously, each reflection containing another reflection, none of them ever arriving at the original face. The philosopher David Hume sat down very seriously in the 18th century and attempted precisely this exercise. He reported with admirable honesty that whenever he entered most intimately into what he called himself, he always stumbled upon some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. He could never catch himself without a perception, and could never observe anything but the perception. He was, in other words, unable to find the viewer behind the viewing. And this from one of the most rigorous minds in the history of Western philosophy. The Eastern traditions arrived at the same impasse centuries earlier, but they responded to it quite differently. Where Western philosophy tended to feel that if you couldn't find the self, it must be hiding somewhere, more cleverly perhaps, in the soul, perhaps in pure reason, perhaps in some transcendent faculty awaiting discovery, the Buddhist and Hindu sages simply began to question whether the search itself was based on a false premise. What if there is no separate, fixed self to find? Not because you don't exist, that would be absurd. Here you are, undeniably present. But because the thing you have been calling I is not a thing at all. It is a process, a movement, a verb that has been masquerading as a noun for your entire life. You see, we have this curious habit of turning everything into an object. The river becomes the river, a fixed thing with a name, as though it were a statue rather than perpetual motion. The flame becomes the flame, as though it were not simply a continuing process of combustion that has no permanent substance whatsoever. And the self becomes the self, a solid, bounded entity sitting somewhere inside the skull, authoring thoughts, making decisions, persisting unchanged from moment to moment while the world shifts around it. But the eye cannot see itself seeing. The ear cannot hear itself hearing. And the mind here is the beautiful, vertiginous truth of it. The mind cannot stand outside itself to observe itself observing. Every attempt to catch consciousness in the act of being conscious produces not consciousness itself, but only another object of consciousness, another thought, another image, another story about the searcher. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence discovering its own horizon. Let us go one step further. Because if you followed the last chapter honestly, if you actually sat with the strange loop of trying to find the thinker and finding only more thinking, then you may have noticed a subtle but rather important assumption. Buried inside the original question, the question who speaks inside your head, presupposes that there is someone there to do the speaking. It presupposes a self, a center, a little homunculus sitting somewhere behind the eyes, pulling levers, reading incoming dispatches, composing replies. And that presupposition is precisely what deserves to be examined, not dismissed, not denied, but genuinely, carefully, unflinchingly examined. Here is what happens when you watch your own thoughts without immediately identifying with them. You notice that they arise, uninvited. A thought about what to have for dinner appears in exactly the same way that a sound from the street appears. It simply arrives without asking permission, without announcing itself, without any identifiable point of origin inside your deliberate choosing. You did not decide to think that thought any more than you decided to hear that passing car. The thought simply appeared in the field of your awareness, and then another, one following the next with the casual inevitability of waves, each one distinct, none of them consulted beforehand. If you were genuinely the author of your thoughts, surely you would know what you were going to think next. But you don't. You never do. The next thought is always, in some fundamental sense, a surprise. Now, the voice in your head will immediately object to this. It will say, no, I chose that thought. I was thinking about the problem deliberately. I was in control of that particular train of reasoning. And this objection is itself fascinating, because the thought that says I was in control is also a thought that simply arose. The claim to authorship is itself unauthored. The assertion of the thinker is itself just another appearance in the field of awareness, no more self-generated than the thought it claims to have generated. You see the loop. You see how the self keeps bootstrapping itself into existence with each new thought, creating the convincing illusion of a continuous author by simply narrating continuously. A river does not need a riverman to flow. The water moves because that is what water does in these particular conditions. And the story of the riverman steering it is added afterwards by the river itself, which has learned to talk. The Hindu tradition has a word for this maya, M-A-H-Ya, usually translated as illusion, but that translation misses the subtlety entirely. Maya is not the claim that nothing exists. It is the observation that things are not quite the way they appear. A rope in a dark room looks like a snake. It is a real rope. The fear is a real fear, but the snake was never there. And the separate, solid, permanent self that seems to be the author of your experience, examining it closely with real patience and honesty, turns out to have the same ontological status as that snake. Not nothing, but not what it appeared to be either. Something far more fluid, far more open, far more interesting than a fixed thing with a fixed name living permanently inside a fixed skull. What you actually are may be far less lonely than you imagined. There is a gap between two thoughts. It is not something you create. It is not something you achieve through discipline or technique or years of dedicated practice sitting cross-legged in a room with incense burning. It is simply there. It has always been there, in the same way that silence is always there underneath every sound, not as the absence of sound, but as the very medium in which sound becomes possible. You cannot have a figure without a background. You cannot have a note without the silence that surrounds it and gives it shape. And you cannot have a thought, not a single one, without the awareness in which it appears, moves briefly, and dissolves back into nothing. Most people sprint past this gap without noticing it exists. The voice is so practiced at filling every available moment with content that the spaces between thoughts go completely unremarked, the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator the moment you stop listening for it. But occasionally, and you know these moments, even if you have never named them occasionally, the machinery slows. Perhaps you are watching light move across water on a late summer afternoon. Perhaps a piece of music has arrived at a particular chord that seems to reach inside the chest and rearrange something quietly. Perhaps you have just received unexpected news, and for one suspended instant, before the commentary rushes in to interpret it, there is simply this: pure, bare, unnarrated presence, the world exactly as it is, before the mind has had time to file it away under a familiar category and move on to the next thing. Zen masters in Japan and China built entire traditions around coaxing people into that gap. Not by filling it with better content, not by replacing ordinary thoughts with holy thoughts, not by substituting worldly concerns with spiritual ones, but by exhausting the thinking mind so completely that it finally, briefly, gives up. The koan is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mechanism for breaking the solver. When you ask, what was your face before your parents were born, you are not expected to search your memory for an answer. You are expected to search until searching itself becomes obviously absurd. And in that moment of absurdity, when the mind stands helpless at the edge of what it cannot think its way through, something opens. Not dramatically, not with trumpets or visions or floods of light, but with the quiet simplicity of a door that was never actually locked in a room you had somehow convinced yourself required a key. What lives in the gap is not nothing. This is the part that surprises people. They expect that beneath the noise there will be emptiness, blankness, a kind of interior darkness that confirms their secret fear that there is nobody home. But the awareness that remains when the voice goes quiet is not empty in that diminished sense. It is empty in the way that a clear sky is empty, vast, luminous, capable of containing everything that moves through it without being altered by any of it. The clouds come and go, the storms, the sunshine, the spectacular theatrical productions of weather, and the sky itself is never damaged, never improved, never anything other than precisely what it always was. Your awareness is that sky, not a metaphor, not a poetic consolation, a description of what is actually here when you stop looking for something more interesting to be. The noise was never the problem. The belief that you were the noise, that was the only difficulty. A student once went to the Zen master, Joshu, and asked with complete sincerity, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Joshu replied, "Mu, not yes, not no." Not a philosophical position, carefully argued over several paragraphs with supporting references, just mu, which means, depending on how you translate it, nothing, or no thing, or perhaps more precisely, not that. Not the kind of answer the question was designed to receive, not a response that fits inside the box the question built for it. The student was supposed to sit with that mu, sometimes for years, until the question and the answer and the questioner all dissolved together into something that could not be contained in any word at all. This is profoundly unfashionable advice in the modern world. We are extraordinarily committed to the idea that every genuine question deserves a genuine answer, that the correct response to confusion is more information, that the correct response to uncertainty is better analysis, that the correct response to not knowing who you are is to think harder about it. And so we read, we discuss, we attend lectures, we accumulate frameworks and models and therapeutic insights and spiritual teachings. And the voice in the head, delighted absolutely in its element, takes all of this material and builds a more elaborate story about the self than it had before. Now, the self is not just anxious and confused. Now, the self is anxious and confused, but also spiritually seeking and philosophically sophisticated and aware of its own patterns, which is somehow supposed to make the whole arrangement more tolerable. You see the problem. You cannot think your way out of a difficulty that thinking created. The Zen masters understood this not as a reason for despair, but as a reason for a very particular kind of laughter. There are recorded moments, and I find these genuinely wonderful, where a student, after years of earnest practice, would suddenly burst out laughing at nothing in particular, not polite laughter, not the civilized chuckle of someone who has understood an amusing point, but real, helpless, slightly undignified laughter at the sheer cosmic absurdity of having spent so long searching for something that was never missing. The 14th century Japanese master, Dogen, wrote that to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things, which sounds, on first reading, like an instruction. Do this, then this, then this. But it is not an instruction at all. It is a description of what happens naturally when the search is finally abandoned, not through giving up in defeat, but through the dawning recognition that the searcher and the searched for were never two separate things. The answer to who speaks inside your head is not a person. It is not a soul, not an ego, not a higher self, not a lower self, not the brain producing electrochemical narratives, not God speaking through the instrument of your particular nervous system. All of those answers are more thoughts, more content for the voice to incorporate into its ongoing autobiography. The actual answer, the one that cannot be spoken but only lived, is closer to the experience of suddenly noticing that you have been breathing this entire time without once deciding to. That the heart has been beating without consulting you, that the eyes have been seeing without requiring your permission, that there is an enormous, intelligent, ceaselessly creative activity happening in and as what you are, and the voice claiming credit for it is like a wave claiming credit for the ocean. Mu, and here is where the koan performs its final movement. Not a resolution, not a triumphant arrival at the destination that was promised in the first chapter, but something stranger and more generous than resolution, a recognition that the journey itself was happening inside the very thing you were searching for, that the seeking was itself an expression of the awareness you were trying to find, that consciousness was never the object of the search, because it was always, without exception, the one doing the searching. You were looking for your eyes with your eyes. And the comedy of that, the profound, aching, ultimately joyful comedy of that, is the whole story. The ancient Vedantic teachers of India had a formula for this. Tat tavam asi tat tvahm, AHC. Thou art that. You are the very thing you have been seeking. Not as a consolation, not as a poetic encouragement to keep trying, but as a plain, literal, almost shockingly simple statement of fact. The awareness in which all your thoughts arise, in which the voice speaks and is heard, in which your entire life unfolds like a dream in the night. That awareness is not something you have. It is something you are, or more precisely, it is what you are when you stop insisting on being something smaller, something more manageable, something that fits inside a name and a history and a set of opinions about itself. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where spiritual teachings have a long and distinguished history of going badly wrong. Someone hears, you are the awareness behind all things, and immediately the voice, resourceful as ever, never missing an opportunity, co-opts the insight entirely. Suddenly there is a self that has achieved enlightenment, a self that now knows it is awareness, a self that feels pleasantly superior to other selves who have not yet discovered what it has discovered. And the whole beautiful opening closes again like a fist. The sky has decided it is a very special sky, superior to all other skies, and requires you to acknowledge this. You will recognize this type. You may even recognize it in yourself on occasion, which is considerably more useful information. The gateless gate, that extraordinary image from the Zen tradition, opens onto no particular landscape. You pass through it and find yourself exactly where you already were. The same hands, the same slightly unreliable knees, the same Tuesday afternoon with its particular quality of light and its particular sounds drifting in through the window. Nothing has changed, and everything is different, in the way that a familiar room looks entirely new when you return to it, after a long absence, not because the room has changed, but because you are, for just this moment, actually seeing it rather than simply recognizing it. That freshness, that quality of genuine contact with the immediate present, is not a spiritual achievement. It is what ordinary experience feels like when the voice stops narrating it long enough for the experience itself to land. You were never lost. The voice convinced you that you were, because the voice needs a problem to solve, a destination to reach, a self to improve, a question to answer. That is its nature, and it is not a bad nature. Language and thought are among the most spectacular things this universe has produced, and the inner narrator, for all its exhausting habits, is also the thing that writes poetry and proves theorems and falls in love and wonders at the stars with an almost unbearable tenderness. But it is not you, or rather it is one of the things you do, not the ground on which the doing happens. The dancer is not the dance, but the dance could not exist without the dancer, and you, whatever you ultimately are, contain both the movement and the stillness, the voice and the silence, the question and the vast, untroubled awareness in which the question floats, unanswered and complete. So, we have followed the question as far as questions can go and arrived somewhere that is not an answer, but perhaps something better, a kind of ease, a willingness to let the voice speak without quite so urgently believing every word it says. Because the voice will continue. It will worry and plan and judge and reminisce and compose its elaborate narratives. That is what voices do. But underneath it, around it, as it, the awareness remains. Steady, unhurried, not achievable, because it was never absent. Not a destination, because you have never been anywhere else. The question, who speaks inside your head, has not been answered. It has been lived. And perhaps that is the only honest way to meet a question that was never really a question to begin with, but an invitation to stop, to listen past the voice, to notice, just for a moment, the extraordinary silence of the one who hears. That one has no name, and it has been here the whole time.